Hello, and welcome to the public hearing for proposed cultivated oyster mariculture grow out site G-0014. And this is a proposed grow out facility in East Galveston Bay. So the purpose of this public hearing is to provide information on the proposed cultivated oyster mariculture grow out facility in East Galveston Bay, answer any questions on the proposed facility, and give instructions on how to submit public comment. A quick background on cultivated oyster mariculture. Throughout the presentation, you may hear me abbreviate that as COM. So if I say COM, that's just the abbreviation for cultivated oyster mariculture. So TPWD permits the activity of mariculture at grow-out sites, also called farms, and nursery hatchery facilities. At grow-out sites, these are all off-bottom mariculture, and applicants nominate their own sites and conduct a natural resource survey on those sites. The TPWD permit is a 10-year term, and only eastern oyster from Texas broodstock are allowed in this type of mariculture. Some types of gear that typically are used for off-bottom oyster mariculture are floating cages, that there are floating buoys. Generally, the cages are down with the buoys on top of the water and the oysters in the water feeding, but they can be flipped up with the oysters out of the water. That allows for some desiccation to remove algae and other predators. Another version of those are floating bags. So with the floating cages, you have smaller bags within a larger structure of cages. The floating bags are generally a slightly larger bags, but again, attached to floats and can do that position of bag in the water, floats on top, and flipped over. And another type you may see are adjustable long line system. So there are posts, and you have baskets, what they call baskets of oysters, and that line moves up between a in the water position, oysters feeding, and then can move up to a desiccation drying position, and then also in case of a storm can be moved very low, closer to the bottom of the water column. For this permit, an annual fee the fee is paid annually based on the size of either the grow out or the nursery hatchery site. And before activities can begin, they must also get authorizations from other agencies, such as the Texas General Land Office, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the U.S. Coast Guard. We do have for grow out sites an active use criteria. That means that that site, they're actively stocking and harvesting, that somebody's just not holding that particular area and not using it. Year-round harvest is allowed. However, they also must comply with all Texas Department of State Health Service regulations. So if the Department of Health has closed a water body for health reasons, you cannot harvest during that time period. A little bit more on some of those Department of Health regulations. On some of our maps, you may see water classification. So that is for oyster harvest, and that classification is done by the Department of Health. They sample the various water bodies in Texas, and then based on those samples and what's found in those waters, they classify those harvest areas for shellfish and our state oysters as approved, conditionally approved, restricted, prohibited, or unclassified waters. Now, these water classifications do not have any impacts on the public's access or recreational activities unless you're recreationally harvesting oysters in those areas. TPWD is not involved in the water body classification system for human health, and for more information on that, you can visit the Department of Health's website. So this proposed site, again, G-0014, is an oyster grow out facility. That means that the oysters there, they're raising up from a smaller size to reach that market size to sell for consumption. The location is in East Galveston Bay. That is in Shellfish Harvest Area TX1, which are approved waters, and it is proposed for 20 acres. Kind of the vicinity map, again, this is located in Galveston County on Galveston Bay over on the Bolivar Peninsula. And then here is the 4 corner coordinates here. This is near what is often called Goat Island in that area. The proposed route map of how they will access the site and travel to the site would be leaving from Smith Point and the harbor there at Smith Point and going across that East Bay to their site. Some more details on the proposed operations plan is that they will be using floating cages, oyster grow, hybrid, shift, high flow. So there's a picture over here. So again, it's where they have floats. Then there's a cage system to contain bags, and then there would be 6 bags within the cage system, and then those are secured within that. They propose 5 columns with 46 lines of cages each, with 15 to 16 cages per line. I'll get to an overhead diagram for that next. The lines of cages will be anchored with a platypus anchor size of B6 that are driven down into the sediment and set. And then the main lines that the cages are attached to are polydac, and those main lines are then attached to steel cables that are at the anchor points. And each anchor point will have a buoy coming up from that. Navigational markers around the sites will be per the U.S. Coast Guard requirements. So they'll submit for marking determination. The Coast Guard will let them know the appropriate navigational markers for the site and then install those per those requirements. Bird deterrence, if needed, they'll be using large zip ties that go around the floats, and then the tails stick out, and there's kind of like spikes off those. There's a picture here that kind of shows an example of that and deters the birds from landing on the floats. So here's an overhead site layout. Again, this shows the 5 different columns of cages, and then within each column 46 lines with 15 to 16 cages on each. In between each column, 3 of them will have a 10-foot spacing between, and then there'll be a larger 32-foot spacing, and then these 2 will also have 10-foot spacing in between. Here's a cross-sectional view of the layout of the different lines of cages. So overhead, see the cages attached along the line. In this cross-section view, you can see the main line down here, and then from that main line, they have what are called lateral lines. So each cage will have 2 lateral line connections to the main line. The main line is then connected via what they call a thimble to the steel cable that goes to the anchor line, and that thimble allows for the adjustment to keep those lines taut and reduce any sort of slacking or curling on those lines. And then off of each cage anchor point, there will be a buoy at the surface marking the anchor points and helping designate where those lines are. More details on the operation plan. The access will be by boat. They don't plan to use or access the shoreline at all there. at least 5 days a week or more as needed to maintain the farm. The floating cage system will be flipped periodically for desiccation. Oysters will be tumbled and sorted as needed on site, on a vessel on site, or transported to land for tumbling, splitting bags, where they divide oysters as the oysters grow, divide between one bag to another. Gear will be expected regularly and maintained to ensure proper working order and that any sort of wear and tear has been fixed. Their hurricane plan that's submitted will follow the yellow, orange, red code approach. So yellow, such as yellow, there's a hurricane in the Gulf. Orange, it's moving closer. Red, we're within the cone of impact. Weather will be monitored frequently to give them ample time to carry out their preparedness operations. They will sink cages if needed for storm and adjust the lines to account for storm surge. Post-storm recovery includes refloating cages, inventorying, and reporting any sort of missing gear. As part of the application, they completed the natural resource survey, so they opted to use side scan sonar along with sediment samples. Here is a zoomed out view of that side scan sonar. Really, what we see in here is the absence of any imagery that would suggest oyster habitat or seagrass habitat. These smaller yellow circle cross indications were various debris that were checked out, and just various debris that were in the water, but not any sort of oyster habitat. They used an EdgeTech 4200, and the transect lines were spaced 69 feet apart. Sediment samples were spaced out on several days through June and July. They took 225 samples within the site and 95 samples within that 200-foot buffer around the site. Samples were collected with a post hole digger. So here's an example of how that is the post hole diggers inserted down in the ground. Sometimes those have much larger extensions on the handles to get down into that sediment. Sample composition was mud or mud and silt, and no presence of oyster habitat or seagrass are found. And here are two representative pictures of those different the sediment samples that they collected. For the next steps for this proposed site is now we are open to consider public comment. Public comment deadline is November 29th. And if you have any public comment about this proposed site, you may email it to oyster.mariculture@tpwd.texas.gov. So after that deadline, if there are any public comment, those are considered, and any changes that may need to be made depending on those comments. A conditional permit is issued. Now, the mariculture activity cannot begin, but they take that conditional permit with all their answers to our applications and their operation plan questions, and they secure authorizations from other state and federal agencies, those agencies listed at the beginning. After all those are secured, they come back to TPWD. We review that, yes, all those authorizations are in place, and then we would issue the final permit that where mariculture activity can begin. So again, if you have public comment about this proposed site, please submit that to the oyster.mariculture@tpwd.texas.gov through November the 29th, 2023. And right now I'll pause to see if there are any questions from participants about this site. Okay, well, I don't have any questions submitted, and I will hand this over to Holly to give a few quick reminders about the recording. Holly, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. So tomorrow you will be getting an email from Zoom. It might look like it's coming from Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. And in that email, you will have a few links, one of which will be to our education YouTube channel, where you will be able to find a link to the recording of, well, you'll find a link to the channel where you'll find the recording. Give us about 24 hours to get the recording posted. There's also a link to our Mariculture website, as well as that oyster.mariculture@tpwd.texas.gov email address. So if there's any questions or comments, you can email us there. So with that, I'll go ahead and wrap it up here. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and we will see you guys next time. Bye everyone.
Bye.